Welcome to episode 2 of the Learning to Play Blood Bowl series for the Underworld University coaches and abroad and elsewhere. We firstly touched in the last episode on what you need to play Blood Bowl. So now we're going to have a little bit more of a focus on, how to actually build your team in preparation for the kickoff effectively. So there are multiple teams and there's multiple different ways of playing the game. So we're going to focus on this video on actually how you build your roster, primarily for like a league format, but we'll also lightly touch on how you would set up a game for an exhibition match, which the rule book details, alongside what you may or may not need to do for tournaments, but we'll be very brief on that. We won't go into too much detail on those two because the UU is a normal league. There will be a few little tweaks and edits to how the league works in those games. But we're effectively just going to focus on the league part, and I'll go into how you would then roster the other two. So a roster in a team means that you have to, obviously you've got the team you want to use, whether it's Games Workshop miniatures, third-party miniatures, proxy miniatures, whatever it is, especially for like university students or people who are learning the game. You might want to have a team or try a team out, but you can always proxy miniatures in to see what they're like. We've got no qualms with that, but kind of practice games, pick up games. You may also want to test your mettle with addition of a few skills or a few star players straight off the bat. And if that's the case, that would be what you want to go for, is an exhibition match, which we'll also just quickly detail as well. We'll jump this and we'll show you what we need to get started. All right, Blood Bowl players. So welcome back. We're going to have a little look at how you roster a team now. But before we get into that, we're going to have a quick look into what exactly a roster is first, alongside what the team sheets are. So effectively in the rulebook here, we've got the back, each of the team lineups effectively. So I'm not going to go into too many details about, which ones are which, but you've got all of the teams really that are available to you at the back here. So we'll have a little look at one of the teams specifically in a minute and how you would add that to a roster, whether that be the written one in here or something else that like we use in the DBL. And there's obviously loads of different variations, but I think once you've kind of got used to how to apply one, you'll hopefully be able to use that for multiple other options. So all the teams are listed in here. Now, for the purposes of this, I'm going to really focus in on the Black Orc team and show how you can add that to different options. And I don't really want to go through all of them. And again, I don't think it's worth going into, what team you should pick and what team, is the best, the worst, or anything like that, because it's going to be up to the personal preference, like we kind of mentioned in the last episode. If you want to run the ball, you probably want a team that's fast. If you want to pass the ball, you probably want a team that has a lot of passing ability. And if you just want to bash stuff, you probably want something like the Black Orc team here, or even the Chaos Chosen. So I hope you can kind of see on the camera, but on each of these kind of rosters, this is what you've got to effectively pick from. So there's a few different parts to it. So if you're over here, you've got the quantity, and that tells you how many of these positionals you can have. So for the Goblin Bruiser Lineman, you can have 0 to 12, 0 to 6 for the Black Orcs, 0 to 1 for the Trained Trolls. And then it gives you the cost. So the cost that's going to take to purchase that player for this season. And then next along is the MA, which is the movement. And we'll get into a whole episode on movement probably after this episode. And that's effectively a number. And that shows you how many squares on the pitch that player can move. The ST, or strength of the player, which relates mostly to blocking and how one player would block an opposition player. And then AG, agility, which is effectively things like picking up the ball, catching the ball, dodging away, things like that. So we'll get into agility and a mixture of movement and sort of passing and catching the ball episodes. And then the brand new skill, but to new players, they won't know that, the passing skill, so PA. So passing effectively is now a separate dice roll. So some players are better or worse at it than they are with their normal agility. So it's changed the game a little bit in terms of the passing game. And then armor value is AV, and that's the armor your opponent needs to break that positional's armor. So an 8+ would mean that your opponent would need to roll 8 or more on 2 dice to get through the armor, which was different previously. So three of the stats are sort of dice roll heavy, so you need to beat the dice roll that's shown there, varying with modifiers, which we'll get into. And then the other 2 are sort of straight stats, movement 6, strength 2, for example. Then you've got skills and traits. Now, we're not going to go into what they are, but these are skills that these positionals have for free. They can't lose them, but they can then add to that as the league progresses. And you can see that different positionals have different amounts, and you will find that some positionals have no skills at all, and that will be detailed by saying NA or none, I believe. And then you've got primary and secondary. Now, don't worry too much about this now. It's all to do with what skills your positionals can get later on in the league. All right, guys, so you've seen the team listings there and what positionals are available to you. So whichever team you pick, your positionals will be different, and you're going to have to now pick which players you would like. So there's only really a few rules in regards to what team or how many players you need and how much you have to spend. So for leagues, which is what we're focusing on here, and we'll go into sort of exhibition and tournament rostering after this. But for leagues, you get 1 million gold pieces. So you might have seen that, like the Goblin Bruiser linemen are 45,000 gold pieces. That's what you need to hire them for the season. So you get 1 million gold. Now, there's only really one rule in regards to the rostering, as it sort of states here, in that you need to have positionals, and you need to have at least 11, and you can have no more than 16. So 11 to 16, you have to have. You don't have to have 16 for the beginning of the league. 11 is fine. So that's the absolutely essential part. You need positionals. Now, reading through the rules, you will notice that your team roster may fluctuate and change as the season progresses. You may have a particularly bad first game and get a death, some missed next games, and you will drop below 11 players. So we'll detail how to fix that going forward. When we have a look at setting up a game. But really the rule is 11 players minimum, and you have to pay for them from your 1 million gold pieces. And then anything left over goes into your treasury. So you then get a treasury left over. So if you've only spent 900,000 on your team, you've then got 100,000 left in the bank. However, certain teams are going to really need to spend all the money straight off. So, we'll have a little look at a team draft list now. So this is the one that's in the rule book. I'll sort of turn the book around so you can kind of see it. This is like their example, which I'm sure you can kind of copy and use yourself. It doesn't have the permission at the bottom. And I'm going to fill out one of these now so you can see what it would look like alongside filling out one of the sort of DBL style ones that are on the Google Drive. All right, guys, so having a quick look at a roster sheet here. So I have filled in one of the team draft lists that Games Workshop have kind of supplied. It's like a free PDF you can download from their website. I'm assuming you can print that off and then you can scribble it in. So I've just filled it out on the computer here just to show you what it kind of looks like. So how you want to do it is you want to go through each line. You want to attribute a number to each player. So, for example, here I've grabbed 5 Black Orcs, numbered 1 to 5, kept them all together. I've then added in their stat lines, which are reflected from the roster that we looked at just a second ago, alongside their skills, their hiring fee, and then also there's a few additional columns that aren't in the team roster. So it's got a thing called unspent SPP here, which you add to as you gain SPP. So every time you kill something or score a touchdown with these players, you get to add SPP to that number. So I recommend, if you're going to be filling it out with paper, is kind of reprinting it every time you need to readjust your team. So you may want to have fill it out in pencil, have a rub it out and rewrite it as you play, because you also may need to rub out players entirely because they might die, and then you might want to rewrite it for your next match to kind of look fresh. There's a few other lines which we won't go into too much detail. One of them is miss next game, niggling injury, NI, and TR, which I believe is temporarily retired. So the three of those, one of those is new, but the three of those you can either tick with a little check. You could also sort of have an N to say that they're not missing next game, and then maybe a Y to say that they are. And then the current value on the far right is the value of that player. So as players increase their skills, they increase their value, but we will look into that later or in a later episode. So at the moment, this is brand new, fresh team. There's no additional skills. There's no miss next games, no niggling injuries. It's all straight out the bat. You'll then see Biff, the trained troll, number 7, and then goblins from 8 to 12 with their skills as well. So that gives you a total of a team value, of 970,000, because we've also added 3 rerolls in at 60,000. That's 180,000 for all of them. We've not added any assistant coaches, cheerleaders, or apothecaries, and we'll go into what all that extra stuff is in a minute. And additionally, I've added dedicated fans, an additional 3 dedicated fans in this situation, which cost me 30,000 gold pieces, but doesn't add to the team value. So we've got no money left in our treasury. We've spent that entire 1,000,000 gold, but we have got a dedicated fans of 4, which means that money doesn't add to it. So we've only got a current team value of 970,000. So filling it out on these sheets is a good way to practice. This is the kind of method that Games Workshop have of course, sent across to everybody to use for free. You're going to want to write it out in pencil so you can kind of fiddle with it going forward, because there's going to be a lot of changes. So you're not going to want to write anything in pen here. You're going to want to change it as and when you can. So that's one way of doing it. And I'm trying to think if there's anything else to go through here. I think that when you add skills, you're going to want to add them in. And additionally, on the back, there is a kind of game reference sheet, which you can add a few other bits and bobs to. Maybe we'll have a look at that later on in the post game. It'll be things like who you played, what your team value was, your inducements you selected, and things like that. So that's kind of a way to fill it out in kind of paper format. You may even make your own one of these, but this is just what they've sent across. Additionally, we also have created our own kind of Excel sheet or sheet stock on Google Drive, which pretty much does the same thing. It kind of works out a lot of the stuff for you. It's a little bit more complicated in terms of what it looks like, but hopefully if you can make sense of the previous one, you'll be able to make sense of this. So again, it's got all of the numbers of the players on the left, the player names, the positions and their stats, the traits they've got and skills. But additionally gives you a little, quite a few extra columns. A little bit daunting to look at now, but effectively the miss next game and niggling injury is there as well with N. And if that has clicks a yes or a Y, it changes the cost of the player. You then got each of the completions, pass interceptions, casualties, touchdowns, MVPs that you'll need to scribble in normally on your sheet. But in this, you can just add them up, top them up, and it gives you a total SPP. It then has what your pool of SPP is as well. So your total SPP will be what you've gained over the season, and your pool SPP will simply be what you've got left to spend. And we'll get into that in a later episode, as we said. And then to the right, past the starting cost, there's a few more columns in between, which, depending on what you add to your player as an advancement, it will add to their total cost. We haven't got the temporarily retired tab in here, so it might be something that we need to add, but this then automatically works out your team value. So total cost there, 970,000 gold. And then, like I said previously, the team value there is 970 shown on the sheet, but that's just kind of a quick reference. Like a TV to 1,000 is 1,000,000, but it's easier to say it quicker. Depends on your preference, really. So that's the 2 different kinds of team roster sheets. And now we'll get into some of the other bits now. So as well as filling out positionals, which you may have noticed in my team sheets I just filled out for the Black Hawk team, there's a few additional sort of sideline staff and other pieces that you may want to add. Now, none of these are essential. However, there's a few things to note. Something that you may want to purchase are team rerolls. Now, I say may, you probably absolutely want to get at least 2 to 3 of these. Now, if we skip back to the back real quickly, you will notice that as well as the positionals, there was a few other extra bits at the bottom here. So it says here, 0 to 8 team rerolls. Every team can only have up to 8, and it gives you a price for those. It also gives you a little note on if an apothecary is available for this team, which for the Blackhawks it is. It also has their tier, which at the moment doesn't have any real rules relating to it, and then special rules, which include like Badlands, Brawl, Bribery, and Corruption for the Blackhawk team, which have their own additional little things, which we'll get into maybe those when we have a look at both the box set teams for people who are looking to sort of get started into that. But really, all you need to look at from there is whether or not they can have an apothecary and what their team rerolls cost. So let's get back to the previous page. Now, team rerolls are essential. You may want to get them. You may decide not to if you'd rather have positionals. However, it's worth remembering that for the Blackhawk team, for example, they're 60,000 gold pieces. And that's the cost when you start the team. But once you've started a league, you'll realise that they're actually doubling costs. So any reroll you want to purchase post the league beginning is that it will cost you 120,000 if you're a Blackhawk team. It still only adds 60,000 to the sort of team value, which we'll get into in just a second. But you're going to want to have to think about getting your team rerolls in with your positionals. So it may mean that you need to save up for a positional, but that's going to be cheaper than trying to save up for another reroll, for example. So as a guide, most teams want to go for 2 to 3 rerolls if they can. And the cheaper the rerolls, obviously, the easier they are to get in. So there's a few other sideline staff. You can, of course, hire some assistant coaches, 0 to 6 of these, and they're 10,000 gold each. But I won't go into what these guys do straight away. And the cheerleaders are the same. They can have 0 to 12 and then they're 10,000 gold as well. Now, they kind of have benefits within the game, mainly in like the kickoff and some of the prayer to Nuffle tables. So they're a little bit situational. And personally, I wouldn't really hire any in a league straight off the bat because you're probably going to want to use that money in your, or keep that money in your treasury because you may have a few thousands left over after purchasing your players. So you might want to keep that money in the treasury. But for things like tournaments and exhibition play where you've got some spare cash left over, which we'll explain later, it could be quite a useful thing to have. And of course, if you've got a bit of money left over, say 5, 6, 7 games in and you fancy buying some because you've got some models for them, fire away. But off the bat, you want to focus on rerolls and positionals. And then also an apothecary is something you may want to get hold of early on. So an apothecary is 0 to 1. And just like earlier, it did say whether or not a team can have it or not. So a Blackhawk team, for example, can have an apothecary, but then others can't. And off the top of my head, things like a shambling undead team can't have an apothecary. An apothecary effectively allows a player to change a injury result. It's not always a done deal, but it gives you much more of a chance to save a player that maybe is important. So early on, especially for things like, teams like elves or teams that have high cost positionals, an apothecary can be quite useful. So 50,000 gold pieces, it could be a good shout to get early on, but you may not have the cash for it. So it's a bit of a toss up, really. It means that your first few games, you may have that risk of losing players, but that's Blood Bowl. It's full of risk, I'm afraid. So that's kind of the additional bits you might want to look at getting. Rerolls are, they're not essential in terms of you don't have to have them like players in terms of the rules, but from my experience, you're going to want lots of them, 2 or 3 of them. That's what you want to leave the house with. 1 is really rough. It's tough to use, especially when you're learning the game. A few more rerolls are going to help. So whatever you can do to get a hold of them, do it. And then the only real thing worth mentioning, I've mentioned the treasury. You've got the dedicated fans, which effectively you start with 1. Now, we'll go into the reasoning this could be quite useful maybe in the post-match sequence, but you can roster dedicated fans up to a maximum of 6. So if you do decide to do this, it means you're going to be getting more fans turning up to your stadium and effectively getting more money. But I think for your first few rosters, try not to worry too much about this. But in some ways, any spare cash you've got left over is best spent on dedicated fans as opposed to the cheerleaders and assistant coaches, because it does give you more money to hopefully get more stuff back later. But we'll get into that at some point. And additionally, the dedicated fans do not add to your team value as opposed to previously. So any older coaches who are looking at this, it does say that the dedicated fans don't add to your team value, which brings us on to it. So the team value is effectively the total cost of your team. So at the beginning, when you're rostering a team, if you spend your entire million, your team value is 1 million. It takes into account team rerolls. It takes into account any sideline staff or apothecaries. It doesn't take into account dedicated fans. So you might spend 980,000 and then spend 20,000 on dedicated fans, but your actual team value would only be 980,000. You might notice some coaches kind of abbreviate it down by 1,000 to make it a little bit easier to make sense of. So rather than saying 1,160,000 my team value, we say 1,160 or 1,160. Up to you in terms of preference. Both make sense, but just so you know, some coaches will say, I'm TV 1,000, I'm TV 1,500, etc., etc. So that's your team value. So your team value should be near or close to 1 million, or exactly 1 million. And then as the league progresses, you will notice that moving around, which is what the current team value is. So let's say, again, your team got really beaten up in the first league game and a few players are missing. Your current team value may be reduced because players that are missing the game do not count towards your team value. So effectively, if you lost a 150,000 gold piece ogre for a miss next game, your team would be 150,000 down as a kind of rule of thumb. But there are a few little caveats around that, which we'll get to in the pre-game sequence. But that's your sort of current team value situation. So that's kind of league setup and what you need to purchase. It kind of becomes clearer when you start rostering things in, and it's worth just trying to mess around with a few different teams to see what you can fit in. But hopefully that helps, and we'll move on to exhibition and tournament rosters now. All right, guys. So really quickly before we sign off, because it gets a little bit confusing. Exhibition play is something that might be a lot of fun for new coaches, especially if you've had a few kind of TV 1,000 or 1 million gold, as it's also known, games where you've just kind of thrown some teams together and had some fun, and you haven't really developed the teams going forward, but you just want to learn the rules. So exhibition is a good way to start to add a little bit of spice to it. So you can, it kind of gives you an overview on this page. I'm not going to go into it too much, but it effectively gives you a little bit more cash. It means that you can hire players, more players than you normally would. You can also hire star players, so you can get a little bit more flair into the game. You can also add skills to players, which it kind of states in here as like an SPP pool, which you can apply to players as you wish, and they don't add to the team value, even though you're only paying a certain amount. So it means that you've got a bit more money to spend. You've got a little bit more scope for what you can add to it. We won't go in massive detail into what that is, but effectively it means you can just kind of get what you like, really. So if you and a friend want to do a TV 2,000 game, you can. You can then decide how much SPP you want to allocate to each teams, or both teams, to make it as fair as possible. You may want to make it thematic. You may want to have, Varag, Ghoul Chewer and Griff Overward to replicate what's in the box set, playing against each other, with a crack team of individuals playing alongside them. So it's a good way of kind of getting a team real quickly together that would maybe take 10 to 15 games in a league to get hold of, and also a good way to make use of the star players. So for a bit of fun, for a bit of a kind of, as it says, an exhibition match, this is a great way of doing it. Now, tournaments are the same in some regards. So the tournament may be that you get 1.2 million to spend, And obviously they may allocate SPP like this now, but they also sometimes give like a skill pack. So they'll say something like all tier 1 teams get 6 normal skills, which will just be something that they can get hold of normally. And then it might be that if you're a tier 3 team, you'll get 6 normal skills and 2 double skills. So you get more skills for the lower tier teams, or you may get more money, but generally it's the same principle. It's effectively a way of making a more, a more experienced team. It's almost a little bit more like an army list, whereas a league roster will ebb and flow throughout a league and change. These exhibition games and tournament games are sort of more like a war game setup where you'll make an army list and you might not change it for a few months. Or for a tournament, of course, it's regen. So you'd have your 13 players, and then the next game, everybody's back. Even if they were all murdered in the game, they'll all be back because it's just like a regen system. And you play the same team yourself every time against someone else's team matching that setup. So tournament and exhibition play, I'd recommend exhibition play to new coaches if they fancy adding some of these skills. They may see some skills in the book they want to try out, and they want to just have a bit of fun. Absolutely the best way to go. However, in terms of making rosters and practicing doing that, the best way to do that is for making a league roster, which we detailed for the majority of this video. So I hope that all helped. I hope that kind of makes sense of the different ways of playing. I hope that makes sense of league rostering. So if you've got any questions, drop it in the comments or message us on the chats. And I guess have fun rostering your teams. Bye.